Hi, folks. You're with Tacitus Today. Tacitus Today, your pushback channel, and thank you for joining this audio live stream. In this essay, I'd like to talk about the mass people movements of history that's going back through prehistory, and compare them to the mass people movements today. Now, the people movements in the past, in fact, in every time other than our modern era, the people movements have had a number of characteristics. They've been natural and organic, created by natural events, and usually a sort of form of displacement. And your tribes, large tribes would then move around. And I'll use sort of Europe and as the main to sort of plunder and pillage Rome. Rome was seen as the glittering eternal city, the bottomless pit of riches. So if you're on the make and wanted to score a quick buck, then Rome was the place where you'd tend to go. And this attitude prevailed long after Rome was well past the wealthy stage and bankrupt, and was being raped and pillaged, financially raped and pillaged so often that it had nothing left, and it went from a population of more than 1 million down to a population of 30,000, and a lot of those were just goat herders. Anyway, coming back to there's a number of people movements now, where farming, as we understand it, modern day farming, which is quite sedentary, was a big change from the lifestyle of just the hunter-gatherer. Now, some of this became because as populations started to increase, particularly around the fertile and temperate regions of the major river valleys like the Nile and the Euphrates River, and a lot of this around the Middle East, but also happening in places like China, the Yangtze River and the like. And as the Ice Age at the time receded, this exposed a lot more land to arable use. And this idea of constantly, hunter-gatherer type thing, apart from being hard work, it brought you into conflict with other smaller tribes or sub-tribes around the place who'd say, hey, we want this for our hunting grounds, so why don't you fuck off, and so on. So then that's when farming began, and it again was around river valleys or areas of good rainfall. In parts of the Middle East where the rainfall was erratic, but the rivers were substantial, and constantly supply, like the Nile, constantly supplying annual deliveries of volcanic rich loam soil for crop growing. Then the change to hunter-gatherer began. Now, inevitably, these people sort of ran out of space because they couldn't really at that stage go far from the river sort of valleys and those parts. Further they got away, then the harder it was to irrigate, the less likely the soil was to be any good. Also, there was this idea of if there wasn't, say, a river that was replenishing the soil every year, like the Nile, then there was a case of exhausting the soils and having to have a couple of fallow years before the soil regenerated and things like this. This created quite a natural impetus for people movement, and as the ice receded, the mini ice age receded, then there was a lot more land available. So people started to move out of what would be considered, modern day Turkey and places around there, and started to move through, started to head westward as the again the ice receding and this land. Now Europe had been very much a hunter-gatherer thing and very, very sparsely populated compared to the ice receding and this land. Now Europe had been very much a hunter-gatherer thing and very, very sparsely populated compared to the rest of the place, the rest of the world, or the rest of that region at least. So if you were a bunch of people wanting to set up farming, then you wouldn't find there was many people around that would dispute your claiming of land to start a farm. Then of course there was farming animals, so you didn't have to run around doing the hunter-gatherer thing, and you could grow your crops and grow your fruit trees and whatever else. So that's when farming became a thing. Now the view is that started sort of sometime around 8 to 10,000 BC, somewhere around there, maybe even a bit earlier, but that's sort of the general view. And it would happen at different times in different places, related again to things like climate and whether the river valleys were accessible and all sorts of things. So that the farming, the hunter-gatherer style changed to a more sedentary existence in farming. Now, if you look at the time it takes, say, for the original farmers around those Middle Eastern river valleys to get to, say, Western Europe, modern-day France as an example, then you're talking many hundreds of years. This didn't happen in 5 minutes. Now, as they moved slowly through, it wasn't necessarily the original population staying absolutely original and static, and then taking 100 years to go from, say, Turkey to France. It wasn't that. You're looking at a lot of intermarrying, interbreeding. Most of the people look pretty much the same. You'd have had it like a greater preponderance of blue eyes in Northern and Western Europe, and more preponderance of brown eyes, creating a hybrid of green eyes, for example. And you'd had these various things intermarrying and interbreeding and so on. So the populations were integrating as much as they were. It wasn't necessarily invasion, and the hunter-gatherers would have had a look at it. It wasn't necessarily invasion, and the hunter-gatherers would have had a look at this new technology, and it would have been new technology to them. Farming, things like how to till the soil and how to plant crops, the timing of the seasons. This would have all been huge technological advancements in the day. And so as these technologies came along, they would have changed lifestyles, changed attitudes. Technology would have been shared, and the people who the hunter-gatherers would look at it, thought, hey, that's not bad. I wouldn't mind giving up this daily bust your ass routine of having to find things to eat. So this would have been a breakthrough in technological lifestyle, social structure type thing, and that would have occurred. Then you had the Bronze Age occurring. Now, the Bronze Age originally occurred in areas where the raw materials, copper and so on, the raw materials for bronze were easily accessible, and you had the wood and the charcoal for the burn. You had this, and you had all the things that were needed were mostly occurring naturally and were easily accessible. So a bit like they say the Chinese invented gunpowder. That's bullshit. The saltpeter and that sort of stuff occurred on the surface along the Silk Road. So when you do your campfire at night to cook your dinner and so on, you find that it's exploding in your face. Well, why is that exploding? What's this stuff? Oh shit, it's gunpowder, or the main ingredient of gunpowder. So where these things were occurring naturally, which would be, say, in today's eastern Poland, northern Romania, that type of area, Ukraine even. So where these things were occurring, that's where the Bronze Age was kind of kicking off. And so these people had at the time a huge technological advantage. Then their society sort of grew in them, and then they moved around. But again, they were all sort of white, and they were all so they were interbreeding and integrating and moving slowly over hundreds of years across into other areas. So these big population movements, they were moving pretty much into adjacent areas that you could walk to, or it was happening over many hundreds of years, and the people who looked pretty much the same habits of living, same attitudes, the same views, very similar languages in a lot of cases. Then they would have kind of half integrated, sort of part invasion, part integration, and part technological change, social structure change, all these sorts of things. So it was very organic and very natural. There wasn't anything. It wasn't imposed by some sort of elite who were imposing on others. It just had this organic flavour to it. As wealth began to concentrate more, for example, the wealth of Rome, a little bit different when people would come along purposefully, specifically to pillage the place. But sure, they may have wanted a place to live, or they may have been displaced. They wanted those sorts of things, but pillaging was very much on their minds. And whether this is the Goths, the Vandals, or the Teutons, or the Cimbri, or the Cimbri, or any of those, coming along in 100 BC to invade Italy. This was the kickoff, by the way. These external invasions was the kickoff to the decline of the Roman Republic, where the political structure of the Republic struggled to manage the idea of hero political generals with a very large standing army. The Gaius Marius in ancient Rome was the 110 BC, whatever it was, around that time. And the invading Cimbri had defeated 2 Roman armies, but Marius developed a new army, the citizen soldier type thing, and or took that to another stage, really, and different training and better organisation, and then to show what a competent general he was, is about 100,000 Roman soldiers, a huge army, really, given the populations of the world at the time, and they were facing an army, reputed to be nearly 4 times that size, but good training, tight discipline and all that sort of stuff. And Gaius Marius delivered a couple of crushing defeats to the Cimbri, and in what the most famous battle being in what is southeast France today, was then called Acquisexti, and the huge victory for the Romans there. But this was the beginning of the end of the Roman Republic. Just looking at population movements then generally, there were still population movements going on, not perhaps quite as organic. The desire for plunder was certainly driving some of that, but for the most part, it's the architecture stayed the same. The idea that that any population moving would move to an adjacent population or an adjacent area, the next door, if you like, would move in there, would intermingle and interbreed. You had some sort of things where, say, the Bulgar tribe, modern day Bulgaria, the Bulgar tribe moved in there, I think, was about 900 AD, somewhere around there, the time of the Eastern Roman Empire. And they named the area, or the area was ultimately named Bulgaria, and that it was primarily Bulgars. But that didn't mean that they didn't interbreed and intermingle and procreate with the local population, some of whom would have been displaced. But there was still that integrating and interbreeding and so on. But again, you see this adjacent population, or where the population moves sort of gradually in a mixture of and this was always so a mixture of time. They move over hundreds of years across an area, but it would be a technological change and a social structural change as well. The social structure brought on by the technology that was introduced by these new people, and you can see that in whether it be the Bronze Age, or the Iron Age. You see this technological change to adjacent populations, or where the population movement was over many hundreds of years, which was so slow and with a rate of integration and intermarrying and interbreeding that really made it, again, appear to be a very organic and natural event, rather than something imposed from above with much aggression and viciousness. Now let's look at today, which is, of course, completely different. Now, in fact, I'll go back even a little bit further there. If you look at the Roman invasion of Gaul, now it was a military invasion, and sure, the Romans put in garrison towns and this sort of thing, and it did affect the language. You can see the effect on the Gallic language of the Roman or of the Latin, but the effect wasn't as great as it, say, was in somewhere like Spain, or even Romania for that matter. So there was a lot of the Gallic sort of structure, and then you had the arrival of the Franks, years later, and the effect of that on the language as well. But the people movement, say to Britain, they weren't, the number of the Romans, for example, going to Britain, the legal language was changed to Latin, and you see that lasting effect. But the amount of Romans there were really garrison soldiers. There wasn't a vast amount of interbreeding. They didn't come in, and the changes that the Romans brought with them were also largely technological, not simply military, but the roads they built and the aqueducts and the port facilities, things like that. There was certainly a lot of Roman technology. The building of Hadrian's Wall, for example, that was quite a considerable feat of engineering at the time, and still viewed that way today. So, and then the arrivals of, say, the feat of engineering at the time, and still viewed that way today. So, and then the arrivals of, say, the Anglo-Saxons. Now, when the Romans left, the local chieftains sort of fell to squabbling again, as they had before the Romans were there, and so each of them were wanting to hire mercenaries to go and nuke the other guy, and the main mercenary sort of adventurers of the time, at least they're up for hire, that could be afforded with the Saxons, the German tribes, and who were also busy pillaging Rome as well. So these guys were hired, and then once they'd done the job and been paid for it, I think we'll stay. Sometimes these mercenaries demanded such huge payments that the local chieftains had no option but to say, well, we'll give you land in return. So instead of paying you money, we'll give you farming land, things like this. So but the Saxons were, they were substantial in number, but not overwhelming the local population. Again, they're an adjacent population, similar languages, they look the same, this sort of stuff. So they interbreeding, intermarrying, and really there was hardly any, because sort of come the Norman invasion in 1066, you'd probably struggle in most instances, to see the difference between them. Now when the Normans arrived, they arrived in relatively small numbers. Again, you're looking at effectively a military occupation, changing the legal code and so on. But eventually the Normans integrated with the local population. So the invasion became almost an absorption, I suppose. And so you see population movements that you wouldn't call that organic, but it was an adjacent population that looked the same and again had the same, they're both Christians and that sort of thing. Now today the course is very different. There's not moving to adjacent populations. Now this is the choice that a displaced population gets. So if someone's displaced out of Pakistan or Bangladesh, or there's some sort of a civil war in Africa somewhere, which is in a permanent state of civil war, or there's a drought or something like that, then you go to the nearest country, the nearest area or nearest place, the country next to where yours is, or the region, and then the United Nations camps can help you get through that difficult time, and you can go back to your homes sort of later on. Now, that would be how things should work, and only adjacent populations interact with each other, or where the population movement takes many hundreds of years and is naturally organic as they slowly sort of move through, bringing new and better ideas with them, newer technology, that sort of thing. Now, that's very different from what it is today. The globalist elite is imposing people on the West and importing peasants from thousands upon thousands of miles away who have nothing in common. There is nothing organic, nothing even remotely organic about these people, and that are being imposed and forced on the West in open and aggressive defiance of the will and desire of the local white population. And if the white population, as they rightly should and must, complain about it or question it, then they're accused of being Nazis and fascists and racists and bigots and xenophobes and every other name you can think of, which is a very choreographed put down. Anyone, people are going to complain about this because we're ignoring their wishes and bypassing their democratic will. So we just have to call them names. That's all we can do if they don't like it, as we force it on them. So I just want to compare those those people movements of the past and just demonstrate how very unusual and atypical of history the current people movements are. There's nothing natural, nothing organic about it at all. It's being imposed. These people would not and could not or be unable to make the journeys if they weren't receiving huge logistical help from the globalist machine that is also imposing these non-assimilation. I mean, these people just won't assimilate into the local population. So ultimately, you'll see the white population being displaced. This small white elite think they'll be allowed to stay in charge at the top while all these black coolies run. I don't think so. As the long game plays out, I don't think that's going to happen. So, which indicates how naive these fucking morons are, by the way. But there is this huge difference today between the mass population movements of the past. So when these activists say, well, population movements will always happen, and it's just like the same as it was yesterday. No, it's not. No, it's not the same. There's not even a tiniest thing about it that's the same. Nothing organic, nothing natural about it. If you were to remove the logistical support and the agitators and the stirrers and the activists all around the refugee camps and going around the peasant, the illiterate peasant villages of Bangladesh and so on, if you were to take that out of the equation, then the people movements would dwindle to almost nothing. You've been with Taskless today, your Pushback channel, and thank you for listening.